how do we determine what a boundary is, why do we use them, and why should we enforce them? So this is a two-part series. The first part is just kind of a general overview about boundaries. And the second part will be getting more in depth, and that will be next Monday. Same time, it's always the same time and place unless I'm away or something's happening, but Mondays at 4 p.m. So usually for about 45 minutes, we generally have an hour blocked away. So boundaries. So most people think of a boundary as something that you tell someone not to do, right? I'm going to be somewhat simplistic in my explanations. And the fact of the matter is that those are not really boundaries. That's just what the general population thinks a boundary is. Boundaries basically are something that you control as the person setting the boundary. And that's where all the power lies. It's not an easy concept, as I said, to understand, but it's certainly more difficult to actually put into full force and effect, right? But it's all because your mind is playing tricks with you, right? You have the ability to control boundaries and set those boundaries in your life. It's a matter of, are you going to do that? And why should you do it? And the reason you do it is because, first of all, you want to take control of your life. And if you have things going on in your life, people that are not respecting your boundaries, you have to be the one to control that and take the power back. And what happens is when we go there, our minds tend to mess with us, right? They say, well, this person isn't going to like us, or they're going to have an issue with it, or I shouldn't be so mean-spirited, or it's my child, or it's my, whatever the circumstance is. The bottom line is you want to be true to yourself. I use this a lot. I always say there's a reason when you're on a plane and they go through the safety exercises that they tell you to put on your own mask first and then to help somebody else. And really this is about taking care of yourself. If you're in a better place, the people in your life are going to be in a better place. So let's start with the first slide. So basically, what is a boundary? So setting boundaries is a skill. And like I said, it's going to lead to your own health and happiness. So what is an appropriate boundary? So whether you're dealing with an estranged spouse or a child or someone in your life, it's something that you have the ability to set, and you're going to make a statement and you're going to tell them what's going to happen if they don't do what you're requesting of them or not do what you don't like. Okay. So there's a couple things you need to know. And let's go to the next slide, Mara. So the next thing is, I'm going to talk a little bit about boundaries. Let's talk about something super simple, right? That's just very obvious. So when you have a fence or a boundary at your home, most people see that as a visual boundary. Don't go past this fence because I'm not welcomed. And that would be considered trespassing. And most people are not going to go past a fence or a blocked area of a home without being invited, right? They just generally understand. And that's a sort of boundary. That's a physical boundary. And you see it and you can identify it. The next thing is more like social norm boundaries. For example, in our country, it is not typically acceptable, or it's just not acceptable to hit somebody, right? If somebody came up to you and hit you, that would be considered inappropriate. So in our society, we know that there's an unspoken boundary, and of course there's laws about batteries. It's called a battery and unwanted touching, but we know that there's certain things in our society that aren't appropriate. You just don't go over and hit somebody. And if you do, that person's not going to like that. That's a boundary violation. And most likely there's going to be a repercussion. Either you get, the police will be called, you might be arrested, things of this nature, right? So that's basically a social norm boundary. And every country, many communities, ethnic groups, etc., have their own set of boundaries that are kind of just part of the culture. The next part of boundaries are personal boundaries. And those are the boundaries that most people are not aware of. So I use the example in my Monday morning message, and we can go forward, Mira, now, talking about your ex-husband. So, for example, in my example in the Monday morning message, I have an ex who, not me personally, but I'm using it as an example, and this was actually happened in one of my cases. I had an ex-husband who found that it was appropriate when he delivered the child back to the ex-wife to basically come in. So what he would do is, there's a guard gate. He would come through the guard gate because his name was still on there and they knew him, right? So whether that even made difference, like he was chummy with the guard gate people, security guards, and he'd come through. And instead of just maybe watching his child go to the front door, he would walk his son to the front door, and then he would open the door because mom used to leave the door unlocked for the child, and he would come in, right? Now, the ex-husband may or may not have known that this was a boundary violation for mom. So think about it. During their divorce, and not all, but in their divorce, they had a pretty good relationship, or soon to be exes go. And they generally own the house together. And it was not uncommon for him to walk in and help with certain maintenance of the home, et cetera, et cetera. And that was kind of the way they established themselves during the pendency of the divorce. When the divorce was over, he felt that he still had the same right. Now, she never communicated differently to him, that she felt it was a boundary violation because of privacy and other issues. So that's not a clear boundary. That's what we call a personal boundary and an appropriate boundary, because it's the boundary being, look, I'm entitled to my privacy, might give a wrong message to the child that dad's coming and going into the home like this, right? Mixed messages for the child. And so you need to relay that. So let's go to the next one. Now, not that you know the boundary makes sense, you have to clearly communicate it. So it's your responsibility to communicate the boundary. And I have many examples of what this looks like. So the first thing you have to think about is, what makes me uncomfortable? What am I struggling with, let's say, with another person in my life? Is it an appropriate boundary? And then how do I communicate this boundary, and what's the purpose for it? So it's your responsibility then to communicate the boundary. So in this case, you want to be clear about it. You can't presume, although it would be probably clear to most of us out there, you don't want your ex-spouse walking into your home, right? Without you saying, hey, you can come in. It's a little strange in most circumstances, but who knows? You know, there are all kinds of post-divorce relationships, right? So you have to make it clear. So I think an email or writing in some way is probably the best way of communicating the clear boundary. Let's go to the next slide. So what does it look like? Now, the next thing you have to do is set forth the consequence if the boundary is not respected. So what does that look like? In this case, and it's not giving some long explanation or trying to have the other person understand your thought process. It's really just very simple. You say something to the extent of, and I think I have it in the next slide. Can we just go to the next one? I think I have it there. Thank you so much. Okay, here I have it. I appreciate you dropping off John at the end of your time sharing. However, I prefer you not walk him into the home without being invited. The next time you walk him through, I'll have to remove you from the guest list and require you to be called in like other visitors. And then I thank you for respecting it. Plain and simple. Now, if the other person gets into, well, we've always been like this, and this is the way, and all these things that typically happen in these types of relationships, that's where you really don't have to say anything more than, listen, this is a boundary that I want respected. I don't feel it's necessary to explain it. And so thank you very much. And that's basically all you have to say. There's other life coaching philosophies that we'll talk about being real in a relationship. That means not color coding things, not saying yes when you mean no, and not having to justify yourself. Just simply saying no is okay, and something that most of us are not good at. Most of us are not good at saying no on any way when it comes to people asking us for things. Okay, so you make a clear request in writing, typically in writing. If you feel there's some kind of a miscommunication, that's it. Now what happens? Next time little Johnny comes home and ex-husband then decides, hey, I'm gonna walk him up again, and she really never means what she says, and so I'm gonna just do as I always did, and there he is walking through the door again, right? Nothing more to have to do with him. What you do now is you just simply take him off the guest list. You lock the door when the phone call comes in from the gate. You probably have to call the gate and remind him, hey, listen, please don't let him in without calling. And then maybe you just lock the door and then you'll let your son in, right? So all kinds of ways we can use boundaries. And the key here, and where all the power lays or is that you're the one that has control over establishing the boundary. I hope that makes sense. You're not relying on someone else to do or not do anything. You get to take action. And so you have to really think, number one, is this a boundary violation and appropriate? Number two, why do I want to assert this boundary? For your own peace and happiness, privacy in this case, and that's 100% acceptable and should be the case. Number three, does the other person know what the boundary is? And then you have to communicate it, and then you take the action. I'm going to use an example in my own personal life. So one of my kids decided that it was appropriate as a teenager to give us some difficulty and stay out late. And it was a challenge, as you can imagine, as some teenagers are. They're all adults now and all doing well, but it was a challenge for many years, right? So telling a teenager not to do something, most of us know that may or may not go in deaf ears. And all the punishments in the world usually don't work, right? And as parents, we sometimes find them hard to enforce and challenging to enforce. So what did we do? We explained to him, listen, your curfew is 10 p.m. on Fridays and Saturdays. If you decide to come in after 10 p.m., the door will be locked, right? Guess what happened? The next time he came in, he was late. It was 10:30. The door was locked. Plain and simple. Hard to take. Lots of email, text messages, lots of knocking on the door. He slept in the patio, appropriate area. He was safe and secure, but he slept there. And we let him in the next morning. Okay, how many times do you think that took? One time. He was never late again. Okay, so it's something we got to control, as opposed to all this fighting and arguing and trying to place restrictions and do things that just we couldn't follow through on. So that's another example. If you have another example, let's go to the next one, Mira. Might be, so let's see what I have here. Your request should always be, let's see, making the request, explaining what you do if it's not followed, and then following through. So another common situation, I talked about it in the video this morning, was if somebody is yelling at you, right? So this happens on a regular basis. Unfortunately, people get into situations and people are unruly in some way, and so maybe they're talking inappropriate. And all you have to say is, listen, if you continue to yell and we can't discuss this on a more appropriate level, I'm going to hang up the phone. And then you don't have to keep getting into it. They continue to yell, you say, you're continuing to yell, I'm hanging up now. And then the beauty is you just have to hang up the phone. That's where the difficult challenge comes in. Can you do that? I suggest that, one of the things we want to do is never make a boundary request that you're not going to actually follow through on. It's better not to make the boundary request than to make it and not be taken seriously. So when you start with these boundaries, you want to start with very small boundaries that you assert in place and try them out on size. Try one that makes more sense and then go to the next one. So do you have any questions, anybody? Any questions? This was short and sweet because I know the subject. But I see that Andrea's there. Didn't know if you had any questions, Andrea. Okay, so this was a quick synopsis about boundaries. I would suggest that maybe we can talk about, I'm going to talk next time about what appropriate boundaries are, the importance of following through on them, how to establish them, and how they will bring more intimacy into your life. It's interesting how when you set boundaries with people in your life, your relationship with them probably is going to have some consequence as a result. And you have to be prepared for that. You have to be ready for the other person not being used to this new you. And they're not going to take kindly to it, most probably. They're going to be in a place of being upset, confused. It's a typical reaction. But the consequence is that you give up yourself. So you have to look, I'm going to set this boundary with this person, and it's probably going to affect my relationship in some way. But what's the alternative of that? The alternative is your own health and happiness. So there is some challenge in the relationship, but that will help to determine what the relationship should look like moving forward. Hopefully it's going to bring you closer. This happens a lot in families. I have a woman right now that I'm coaching on the side, and she has a very challenging relationship with her mother, who finds it necessary or wants to just drop by, much like the ex bringing the child home. Mom of my client wants to constantly just drop by. Now that's changed a lot with the virus, so that's put a little bit of a hamper on that, meaning now there's a boundary that's been placed that's known. But when that wasn't the case, she had a real hard time having her mom understand that you have to call before you come over. It's not always appropriate. And there was a lot of trying to get her mom to understand this. And finally, she just had to set the boundary and tell her that she wasn't going to answer the door. Challenging. I'm not suggesting it's not. It's difficult to do these, especially with people that are so close and you love so much, you know. But really, it's for your own peace and happiness. So, what would not be appropriate boundary? Do I have another? Is there another one there? Let's see. Yes. I talked about the yelling, no long drawn out reason why, instead just be clear. Is there anything more, Mira? Is there one more? Okay, no, just my thing. So let's go back to the last one. So what is not an appropriate boundary? If you want someone to do something in your life to make you what we call happy, that's another conversation in life coaching. But for example, you want your spouse to be more romantic, or you would like someone to celebrate your birthday a certain way, or these are not appropriate boundaries. These are not subjects that are part of what a boundary should be. These are desires and wants. Last week we spoke about the manual, and that adults get to be who they want to be, right? We can't control them. So knowing what an appropriate boundary is probably the first step.